I'm Sarah, 26, and 3 months ago I thought I was saving my family's century-old business by marrying a stranger. My parents convinced me it was the only way to secure our legacy after mounting debts nearly destroyed everything we'd built. What I didn't know was that my new husband had been investigating my family for years, collecting evidence of their darkest secrets. The wedding wasn't a business merger, it was the beginning of the most calculated revenge I've ever witnessed. Before we dive into this wild family revenge drama, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below and smash that like button if you're ready for a story that'll make you question everything about family loyalty. Don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss how this twisted tale of betrayal and justice unfolds. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, I always knew the weight of the Morrison name. Our family had owned Morrison and Associates, a prestigious architecture firm, for 4 generations. The elegant antebellum mansion we called home, the exclusive country club memberships, the charity galas, everything screamed old money and Southern aristocracy. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Morrison, made sure I understood that preserving our legacy was my duty as their only child. But by my 25th birthday, cracks were showing in our perfect facade. Hushed phone conversations ended abruptly when I entered rooms. Important-looking documents disappeared quickly from my father's desk. My mother's charity luncheons became fewer, and her designer shopping trips stopped entirely. When I asked about the changes, they dismissed my concerns with practiced smiles and vague reassurances about temporary adjustments. The truth hit me like a freight train on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. I'd come home early from my job at the local museum to find my parents huddled over stacks of papers in the living room. Red notices, bank statements, and legal documents covered the coffee table like fallen leaves. My father's head was in his hands, and my mother was crying, actually crying, something I'd never seen her do in public. "Sarah, we need to talk," my father said, not bothering to hide the papers this time. His voice carried a heaviness I'd never heard before. The numbers were staggering. Nearly $2 million in debt, missed loan payments, and creditors circling like vultures. The business that had been our pride for generations was 30 days away from bankruptcy. How did this happen? I asked, sinking into my childhood armchair. My mother dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, struggling to maintain her composure. Poor investments, the economic downturn, some bad contracts, my father explained, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. "We've tried everything, Sarah. Refinancing, selling assets, even considering selling the house. But there's one option left." That's when they told me about the Hartwell family. James Hartwell Sr. owned one of the most successful development companies in the Southeast. His son, James Jr., was 32, successful in his own right and, according to my parents, the perfect solution to our problems. A marriage between our families would bring fresh capital, merge our architectural expertise with their development empire, and secure both legacies for future generations. An arranged marriage, I laughed, thinking they were joking. "Mom, Dad, this isn't the 1800s. But they weren't laughing. My mother leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Sarah, this isn't just about money. It's about everything our family has built. Your great-great-grandfather started this business with nothing but ambition and a dream. Are you going to be the generation that lets it all slip away?" The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Every family dinner where they'd talked about legacy, every story about ancestors who'd sacrificed for future generations, every lesson about duty and responsibility, it all came crashing down on me. They weren't asking me to marry a stranger. They were asking me to save our family's entire history. "Have you even met this James?" I asked, grasping for rational objections. "We've had several business meetings," my father replied. "He's intelligent, well-educated, comes from a good family. He understands this is a business arrangement, but he's expressed genuine interest in getting to know you properly." my mother added. We wouldn't ask this if we had any other choice, darling. But James has already agreed to cover our immediate debts as soon as the engagement is announced. The wedding would secure a long-term partnership that benefits everyone. I spent 3 sleepless nights weighing my options. I could refuse watch my family lose everything and start over somewhere else with a clear conscience but a broken family legacy. Or I could agree, save the business, and hope that maybe, just maybe, this James person and I could build something real together. The deciding factor came when I visited my grandmother's grave. Eleanor Morrison, I had built this family's foundation through the Great Depression, raising 5 children while keeping the business afloat when my grandfather was overseas during World War II. Her stories had inspired me throughout my childhood. Standing at her headstone, I could almost hear her voice telling me that sometimes love comes from sacrifice and that family loyalty requires difficult choices. I called my parents that evening. I'll meet him first, I said. One dinner. If he's horrible, the deal is off. The relief in my mother's voice was palpable. Oh, sweetheart, you won't regret this. James is coming to Charleston next weekend. We'll arrange something lovely. That weekend, James Hartwell Jr. walked into our lives like he belonged there. Tall, dark-haired, with kind eyes and an easy smile that seemed genuine. He was articulate without being arrogant, successful without being flashy. During our dinner at Charleston's most exclusive restaurant, he was the perfect gentleman, pulling out chairs, asking thoughtful questions about my work at the museum, sharing stories about his travels and business ventures. I want you to know, he said, over dessert, I understand this situation isn't ideal. I'm not expecting you to fall in love overnight or even at all. But I hope we can be friends, maybe partners, in building something good together. His honesty was refreshing. No false declarations of love, no pressure for immediate intimacy, just a straightforward acknowledgement of our circumstances and a genuine offer of companionship. We dated for 3 months, dinners, cultural events, long walks through Charleston's historic district. He was patient, funny, and surprisingly easy to talk to. When he proposed on a sunset carriage ride through the city, the ring was tasteful, and the words were sincere even if they weren't passionate. I can't promise you a fairy tale, he said, but I can promise you respect, partnership, and the chance to save everything your family has worked for. I said yes, and for a brief moment, standing there in the golden light with church bells ringing in the distance, I actually believed we might make this work. Our wedding was everything Charleston society expected: elegant, traditional, and expensive, street. Michael's church was filled with white roses and magnolias. The reception at the historic rice mill featured a string quartet and enough champagne to float a yacht. My dress was my great-grandmother's, altered to fit perfectly, carrying on another family tradition. But underneath the Southern charm and celebration, I felt like I was performing in a play. James was the perfect groom, attentive, charming, saying all the right things to all the right people. He danced with my elderly aunts, complimented my mother's choice of flowers, and gave a wedding toast that had half the guests dabbing their eyes. Yet something felt rehearsed about it all, like he'd practiced these moments. You look beautiful, he whispered during our first dance, and I wanted to believe the warmth in his voice was real. Thank you, I replied, meaning it. He did look handsome in his tuxedo, and his smile was genuine when he spun me around to the music. For a moment, swaying to the soft melody under twinkling lights, I thought maybe this crazy arrangement might actually work. The honeymoon in Savannah was pleasant, but oddly formal. We had separate bedrooms, his suggestion, which I appreciated, and spent our days touring historic homes and gardens. James was knowledgeable about architecture and history-making for interesting conversations as we explored the city. We held hands for photos, shared meals at romantic restaurants, and even laughed together over silly tourist attractions. But at night, when we retired to our separate rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sharing this experience with a very polite stranger. Moving into the Hartwell family home after the honeymoon was an adjustment. The mansion in Charleston's French Quarter was stunning. 3 stories of perfectly restored antebellum architecture with modern amenities seamlessly integrated. James gave me free rein to redecorate the master suite and several common areas, and his enthusiasm for my design ideas seemed genuine. You have incredible taste, he said, watching me arrange furniture in what would become my personal sitting room. The museum's lucky to have you. That comment stuck with me because he'd been encouraging about my career from the beginning. While my parents had always seen my job as a pleasant hobby before marriage, James insisted I continue working. He even donated generously to the museum's restoration fund, earning me significant recognition from my colleagues. Life settled into a comfortable routine over the following weeks. James left early for work at Hartwell Development. I headed to the museum and we reconvened for dinner most evenings. He was an excellent cook, often surprising me with elaborate meals when our housekeeper had the night off. We'd discuss our days, share stories from our childhoods, and slowly build something that felt like friendship. He never pushed for physical intimacy, though he was affectionate in public when the situation called for it. A hand on my back at social events, a quick kiss on the cheek when leaving for work, the kind of gestures that convinced everyone around us we were a happily married couple finding our way together. But there were odd moments that made me wonder what was really going on in his head. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, not romantic, not calculating, just studying, like he was trying to figure something out. When I'd ask what he was thinking, he'd smile and change the subject. He also had certain habits that seemed at odds with the spontaneous, easygoing personality he showed everyone else. His home office was strictly off-limits locked whenever he wasn't in it. He received phone calls at strange hours, always stepping outside or into another room to take them. And despite his family's wealth, he was surprisingly frugal about certain things, refusing to hire additional staff, doing his own yard work, insisting we use coupons when grocery shopping. Old habits, he'd explain when I teased him about it. My grandmother always said you should know the value of $1 no matter how many you have. The strangest incident happened 6 weeks after our wedding. I'd come home early from work with a migraine, hoping to rest before a charity dinner that evening. As I approached the front door, I heard voices from James's office, his voice, and another man speaking in urgent, hushed tones. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was serious, almost conspiratorial. I tried the front door quietly, but the old brass handles squeaked. Immediately, the voices stopped. By the time I called out, "Hello, I'm home early," James appeared in the hallway, looking perfectly normal, though I noticed his office door was firmly closed behind him. "How's your head?" he asked, showing immediate concern. "You look pale. Just a headache." "I thought I heard voices," conference call, he said quickly. "Nothing exciting. Go lie down, I'll bring you some tea." He was so attentive for the rest of the evening, checking on me, adjusting pillows, even calling to cancel our dinner plans so I could rest, that I felt guilty for being suspicious. This was what caring looked like even without romantic love. Maybe I was just overthinking things because the situation felt surreal. But that night, as I was falling asleep, I heard a car pull up in our driveway very late. From my bedroom window, I saw a figure in a dark jacket walking away from our house, though I couldn't make out who it was. When I mentioned it to James the next morning, he seemed genuinely puzzled. "I didn't hear anything," he said, buttering his toast. "Maybe it was someone turning around in the driveway. Happens all the time with GPS mix-ups." His explanation made sense, but something about the way the person had moved purposefully, familiarly, suggested they knew exactly where they were going. Still, life was good. Better than good, actually. My family's debts were cleared, the business was thriving with new contracts from Hartwell Development, and my parents were happier than I'd seen them in years. James and I were building something that felt like partnership, maybe even the beginnings of real affection. I started to believe that maybe arranged marriages weren't such a terrible idea. Maybe this was how love was supposed to develop, slowly built on respect and shared goals, rather than passion and drama. I had no idea that everything I thought I knew about my new husband, my family, and my entire life was about to crumble in the most spectacular way possible. The truth began unraveling on a humid Thursday morning in June, exactly 3 months after our wedding. James had left for what he said was a business trip to Atlanta, kissing my forehead goodbye and promising to call that evening. I was in our bedroom, finally organizing the last of my belongings, when I noticed something odd about the antique armoire I'd been using for my winter clothes. The back panel seemed slightly warped, creating a small gap I hadn't seen before. When I pushed on it to straighten it out, the entire panel shifted, revealing a hidden compartment I never knew existed. My heart raced. What kind of secrets did old Southern homes hide in their walls? Inside the narrow space, I found a manila folder thick with documents. My hands shook as I pulled it out, expecting perhaps historical papers or old architectural plans. Instead, I found surveillance photos of my family, dozens of them dating back years. My father entering and leaving buildings I didn't recognize. My mother meeting with people I'd never seen before, even photos of me at work, walking to my car, having lunch with friends. But that was just the beginning. Underneath the photos were financial records, not the records my parents had shown me, but different ones entirely. Bank statements showing regular large deposits into offshore accounts, invoices for consulting services that didn't match my father's business, and most shocking of all, contracts with a company called Meridian Holdings for development projects I'd never heard of. My breath caught when I saw the signature on those contracts, Richard Morrison, and countersigned by someone named Michael Vance, whose name appeared on multiple documents as a partner in schemes that looked suspiciously like money laundering operations. The deeper I dug, the more horrifying it became. My family's debt crisis wasn't from poor business decisions or economic downturns. It was because my father had been caught embezzling funds from client accounts and using the business as a front for laundering money through fake development projects. The real story wasn't about saving our family legacy, it was about covering up federal crimes. And James knew. Not only did he know he had been documenting everything methodically, building a case file that would destroy my family completely, at the very bottom of the folder I found a letter that made my blood run cold. It was typed on plain paper dated just 1 week before James first contacted my parents about the marriage arrangement, Mr. Morrison. I have in my possession evidence of your involvement with Meridian Holdings and the systematic theft of client funds totaling $3.7 million over the past 5 years. I also have documentation of money laundering operations conducted through your architectural firm. You have two choices: cooperate with my plans regarding your daughter or face federal prosecution. I will be in touch with a proposal shortly. J. H. This wasn't a business merger. This wasn't even about money. James had blackmailed my parents into forcing me to marry him, and I was the payment for their crimes. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the papers. Everything made sense now: why my parents had been so desperate, why they'd seemed relieved rather than sad about the arrangement, why James had been so prepared with solutions to all their problems. He hadn't fallen into our lives. He'd orchestrated everything. But why? What could he possibly gain from marrying me if he already had enough evidence to destroy my family? Why go through months of courtship, the wedding, playing house with me? I was still sitting on the bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of my husband's deception, when I heard the front door open. James's voice called out, "Sarah, I'm back early." Panic shot through me. I quickly stuffed everything back into the folder and shoved it into the hidden compartment, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it from downstairs. I had maybe 30 seconds to compose myself before he found me. "Up here," I called, trying to keep my voice steady while smoothing down the armoire panel. "Just organizing some clothes." His footsteps came up the stairs, and when he appeared in the doorway, I saw him with completely new eyes. That kind smile I'd grown fond of. Was it completely fake? The gentle way he'd treated me during our courtship, had it all been an act? "How was your trip?" I managed to ask, sitting on the bed and hoping I looked normal. "Productive," he said, loosening his tie. But something in his expression had changed. His eyes swept the room, lingering on the armoire, and I swear I saw the briefest flicker of suspicion cross his face. "Everything all right? You look a little pale." "Just tired. Long day at the museum." The lie came surprisingly easily, though my mouth felt dry as sand. He nodded, but continued watching me with that studying expression I'd noticed before. Now I understood what he'd been doing all those times, calculating, evaluating, making sure his plan was working as intended. That evening was torture. We had dinner together as usual, discussed our days, watched a movie on the couch. James was as attentive and charming as ever, but every gesture felt sinister now. When he kissed my cheek goodnight, I had to suppress a shudder. I lay awake until I heard his breathing become deep and regular, then crept back to the armoire. By moonlight filtering through the curtains, I photographed every document with my phone, my hands still trembling with each click. If James was playing a long game, I needed to understand the rules before I could figure out how to survive it. This story has taken such a dark turn, hasn't it? I know you're probably thinking the same thing I was. How could someone plan something so elaborate and cruel? But trust me, we're nowhere near the bottom of this rabbit hole. Yet. If this level of betrayal has you gripped, make sure you're subscribed, because what I discovered next about James's real motivations will blow your mind. And honestly, I need your support in the comments right now. Have you ever discovered something that completely shattered your reality? Let me know below, because I'm about to share how this nightmare gets so much worse. One thing kept bothering me as I stared at those damning documents. If James already had enough evidence to send my parents to federal prison, why had he chosen this elaborate marriage scheme instead? What was his endgame? The man sleeping peacefully in the next room had spent months gaining my trust, and I still had no idea what he ultimately wanted from me. But I was about to find out, and the truth was more twisted than anything I could have imagined. I became a detective in my own marriage, and it was the most terrifying education of my life. Over the next 2 weeks, while maintaining the facade of devoted wife, I systematically investigated the man I'd promised to honor and cherish. Every smile felt like a lie. Every casual conversation became an interrogation I had to navigate carefully. My first breakthrough came from an unlikely source, our housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez. She'd worked for the Hartwell family for nearly 20 years, and during a casual conversation while she folded laundry, she mentioned something that made my blood freeze. "Mr. James, he's so different now," she said, in her accented English, shaking her head sadly. "Before his brother died, he was such a happy boy. But after that terrible thing happened, he changed. Became so serious, so focused. I nearly dropped the vase I was arranging. His brother James never mentioned having a brother." Mrs. Rodriguez looked surprised. "Oh, yes, Senora. Miguel Michael, he called himself, older by 3 years. They were very close until—" She trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Until what?" I pressed gently. "Until that business with your father. Miguel, he got mixed up with bad people and then he died in that car accident. Mr. James, he blamed." She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd said too much. "I should not talk about family business." Excuse me. No amount of gentle questioning could get her to say more, but she'd given me the key piece I needed, Michael. The name from the contracts, the partner in my father's schemes. James's brother had been involved with my family's illegal activities, and he was dead. That night, while James attended what he claimed was a business dinner, I broke into his office. The room was meticulously organized, like everything else about James, but now I knew what to look for. Hidden behind architectural awards and family photos, I found a file cabinet with a lock that yielded to a bobby pin and desperate determination. Inside, I discovered the complete story of my husband's calculated revenge. Michael Hartwell had been brilliant but troubled, struggling with addiction and poor judgment. 3 years ago, he'd gotten involved with Meridian Holdings as a way to make quick money. According to James's detailed notes, my father had recruited Michael, exploiting his desperation and gradually drawing him deeper into increasingly complex money laundering schemes. But Michael had wanted out. The documents showed escalating payments to rehabilitation facilities, evidence that he'd been trying to get clean and leave the criminal world behind. My father, according to recorded phone conversations transcribed in James's meticulous handwriting, had threatened to expose Michael's involvement to the authorities unless he continued cooperating. The final entry in the file made my heart stop. Michael died in single-car accident. Route 781147 p.m., June 15th. Alcohol level 0.24. Suicide note found in vehicle. I can't live with what I've done. The money isn't worth my soul. Richard Morrison was the last person to speak with him 9:33 p.m. that same evening. Phone records showed a 37-minute conversation between my father and Michael just hours before Michael drove his car into a concrete barrier at 90 miles per hour. James had spent 2 years after his brother's death building an ironclad case against my father, documenting every transaction, every conspiracy, every crime. But simply having Richard Morrison arrested wasn't enough for him. He wanted total destruction of the business, the family reputation, and most chillingly, of me. The marriage wasn't just blackmail. It was the perfect vehicle for complete revenge. By becoming part of our family, James gained access to everything: financial records, personal documents, social connections, and most importantly, the perfect inside position to watch us suffer when he finally revealed the truth. But there was more. A timeline in his handwriting showed his ultimate plan. Phase 1, marriage and integration complete. Phase 2, gather remaining evidence and personal intelligence in progress. Phase 3, coordinate with federal authorities for maximum impact. Phase 4, public revelation and family destruction, estimated timeline August. August was 6 weeks away. The most disturbing discovery was a psychological profile he'd written about me based on months of observation. He'd cataloged my habits, my relationships, my emotional triggers, even my sleep patterns. One particularly chilling passage read, "Subject demonstrates strong family loyalty despite evidence of dysfunction. Emotional manipulation through guilt and duty highly effective. Genuine affection developing as planned, which will maximize psychological impact during revelation phase." Everything I'd interpreted as growing closeness he'd calculated as psychological warfare. I photographed everything with shaking hands, my wedding ring catching the light mockingly as I documented my husband's plan to destroy my entire world. The hardest part was reading his notes about our intimate moments dinners, where I'd felt we were connecting conversations, where I'd shared childhood memories, even the small gestures of affection I'd thought were real. He'd analyzed them all as data points in his revenge strategy. By the time I heard his car in the driveway, I'd locked everything back in place and returned to our bedroom. When he came upstairs, I was in my nightgown pretending to read a novel while my mind raced through everything I'd learned. "Good book?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed to remove his shoes. His voice was warm, concerned, the same tone that had been slowly winning my trust for months. "It's about a woman who discovers her husband isn't who she thought he was," I said, testing him. He paused in unlacing his left shoe, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his face, surprise, perhaps even fear. But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Sounds intense," he said carefully. "Does it end well for her? I haven't finished yet," I replied, meeting his eyes. but I have a feeling it's going to be quite a revelation. We stared at each other for several long seconds, and I wondered if he was analyzing my words, looking for signs that I knew something. But then he smiled, that same gentle smile I'd grown to trust, and I realized that he was still convinced he had complete control of the situation. "Well, I hope she gets the ending she deserves," he said, kissing my forehead before heading to his own room. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew I had a choice to make. I could confront James directly, but that would only accelerate his timeline. I could run, but that would leave my parents to face the consequences alone. Or I could do something he'd never see coming, beat him at his own game. The man sleeping in the next room thought he was the only one capable of long-term planning and calculated revenge. But he'd made one crucial mistake in his psychological profile of me. He'd underestimated what a Southern woman is capable of when she's protecting her family, even when that family has made terrible choices. I spent 3 sleepless nights developing my own strategy. James thought he knew me, but his psychological profile had missed something crucial. I wasn't just a dutiful daughter preserving family legacy. I was a museum curator who'd spent years researching, documenting, and exposing the truth about the past. If he wanted to play games with evidence and long-term planning, I was more prepared for that battle than he realized. My first move was to approach this like any historical investigation. I needed to understand not just what had happened, but why, and what alternatives might have existed. James's narrative painted my father as a predatory criminal who'd exploited his vulnerable brother, but something about that story felt incomplete. I started by accessing my father's personal files while my parents were at their weekly golf game. What I found complicated everything I thought I knew. Yes, my father had been involved with Meridian Holdings, but the financial records told a different story than James's version. The payments to Michael weren't recruitment fees or profit sharing, they were loans. Large ones made when Michael was in and out of expensive rehabilitation facilities. My father had been supporting James's brother's recovery attempts, not exploiting his addiction. The dates lined up. Every payment to Michael corresponded with a treatment program or sober living facility. More damning to James's revenge narrative were the recorded conversations I found on my father's old phone. Unlike the transcripts in James's files, these were complete recordings, and they painted a very different picture of that final phone call. Yes, my father had threatened Michael, but not to force him to continue criminal activities. He'd threatened to cut him off financially if Michael didn't complete his current rehab program. "I'm done enabling this, Michael." My father's voice was clear on the recording. "If you walk out of that facility tonight, don't call me for money again. I've spent nearly $500,000 trying to help you get clean, and I won't watch you kill yourself anymore." Michael's response was slurred and angry. "You don't understand, Richard. The pressure, the people I owe. I can't live with what we've done. The money laundering, all of it. I'm going to tell them everything." "Then tell them," my father said firmly. "I'll support you through testimony, Michael. But you need to be sober to do it right. Go back inside. Let me help you get through this properly." The call ended with Michael hanging up. 2 hours later, he was dead. Suddenly, James's elaborate revenge plot looked less like justice and more like misplaced grief and rage. His brother hadn't been a victim of my father's manipulation. He'd been a troubled young man whose addiction had led him into criminal activity, and my father had been trying to help him find a way out. But understanding James's motivation didn't change the fact that my family had committed federal crimes. Money laundering was still money laundering regardless of whether Michael had been coerced or recruited willingly. The question was, how could I save my family while exposing James's deception? The answer came from an unexpected source: my grandmother's diary. I'd inherited Eleanor Morrison's personal papers when she passed, but I'd never read through everything carefully. Searching for any family precedent for dealing with crisis, I discovered that my grandmother had faced a similar situation during World War II. Her husband, my grandfather, had been accused of selling architectural plans to enemy agents. The charges were false, but the evidence looked damning. Instead of denying the charges or running, my grandmother had done something brilliant. She'd gathered counter-evidence, proving who was actually responsible, while simultaneously cooperating with authorities to expose the real criminals. Her detailed diary entries showed how she'd played a careful game, appearing to support the investigation while actually directing it toward the truth. Following her example, I decided to approach the FBI myself. Agent Sarah Chen listened to my story with professional skepticism until I started producing evidence. James's blackmail letter, his surveillance photos, his detailed revenge timeline, and most importantly, the complete recordings that contradicted his version of events. Mrs. Hardwell, Agent Chen said carefully, "Are you aware that by bringing this information to us, you're potentially implicating your family in serious federal crimes?" "I'm aware," I replied, "but I'd rather they face justice for what they actually did than be destroyed by someone seeking revenge for something they didn't do." Agent Chen studied the documents for a long time. Finally, she looked up. "Your husband has been in contact with our office. He's scheduled to present his evidence to a grand jury next month. But this information you've brought changes things significantly." "How so?" "Well, for starters, blackmail and extortion are also federal crimes. And if his evidence has been selectively edited to support false narratives, that's obstruction of justice." She paused, tapping her pen against the desk. "Would you be willing to help us investigate your husband's activities? It would mean wearing a wire, documenting his statements about the case, possibly testifying against him." The irony was perfect. James had married me to gain inside access for his revenge. Now I would use that same inside access to expose his crimes. What happens to my parents? They'll still face charges related to the money laundering. But cooperation in exposing your husband's extortion scheme would be taken into consideration. And honestly, based on these recordings, the case against your father looks more like conspiracy charges than leadership of a criminal enterprise. Over the next week, I wore a wire during every conversation with James, documenting his admissions about blackmailing my family and his plans for their destruction. The most damning evidence came when I asked him directly about his brother's death. "You must miss Michael terribly," I said over dinner, the recording device hidden in my watch. James's expression darkened. "Every day. He was a good person who got manipulated by criminals. It sounds like he was struggling with addiction too. That must have made things even harder." "The addiction was a symptom, not the cause," James said firmly. "Your father recruited him when he was vulnerable, used his problems against him. Michael wanted to get clean, but Richard wouldn't let him walk away." "That's terrible. You're sure that's what happened? I have recordings, Sarah." "Your father threatened him the night he died, told him there was no way out. It was a complete fabrication, directly contradicted by the evidence I'd already given to Agent Chen. James wasn't just seeking revenge based on grief, he was actively lying about the circumstances of his brother's death to justify destroying innocent people." That night after James fell asleep, I sent a text message to Agent Chen. "I have everything you need." The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for James to walk into it. The end came on a sweltering July morning, exactly 1 month before James's planned revelation. I was having coffee on our veranda, pretending to read the newspaper while actually watching for the unmarked cars Agent Chen had told me would arrive at exactly 9 a.m. James was in his office making what he thought were final preparations for my family's destruction. At 9:03, 3 black SUVs pulled into our driveway. "James?" I called out, my voice carefully modulated to sound confused rather than triumphant. "There are some official-looking cars here." He appeared at the front door just as Agent Chen and 5 other federal agents approached the house, badges displayed and faces serious. I watched his expression change from confusion to understanding to barely controlled panic in the span of 3 seconds. "James Hartwell, Jr. Agent Chen announced formally, "You're under arrest for extortion, blackmail, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to provide false evidence to federal investigators." "There must be some mistake," James said, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes found mine, searching for some sign that I was as surprised as I was pretending to be. "No mistake, Mr. Hartwell. Your wife has been very helpful in our investigation." Agent Chen nodded to me as another agent began reading James his rights. The look of betrayal on James's face was almost comical. After months of calculated deception, he couldn't believe that someone had outmaneuvered him. "Sarah, what did you do?" "I protected my family," I said simply. "Just like you were trying to protect yours. The difference is, I didn't have to destroy innocent people to do it." As they led him away in handcuffs, James called back desperately, "Your father is still a criminal. The money laundering, the offshore accounts, that's all real." "I know," I replied, "and he'll face appropriate consequences for his actual crimes. But he won't be destroyed by your lies about Michael." The rest of that day was a blur of statements, interviews, and legal proceedings. My parents, when confronted with the evidence against them, chose to cooperate fully with authorities. My father's confession was heartbreaking, but honest. Yes, he had laundered money through the business, but it had started as a way to help Michael hide assets from drug dealers he owed, and had gradually escalated beyond his control. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," my father said, tears streaming down his face as we sat in the FBI field office. "When Michael died, I thought it was over. I thought we could just pay back what we owed and move on." "Why didn't you tell me the truth when James first contacted you?" I asked. My mother answered, her voice barely a whisper, "We were so ashamed, Sarah. And when James showed us evidence that could send your father to prison for 20 years, agreeing to the marriage seemed like the only way to protect you from scandal." The final pieces of justice fell into place over the following months. My father was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security prison and ordered to pay restitution. But the cooperation agreement meant he avoided the decades-long sentence James had been threatening. My mother received probation and community service. James, on the other hand, faced serious federal charges. The blackmail scheme alone carried a possible 10-year sentence, and the evidence tampering added additional years. His lawyer tried to argue that grief over his brother's death had driven him to temporary insanity, but the meticulous planning documented in his own files proved clear premeditation. The most satisfying moment came during his sentencing hearing when I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. James sat at the defendant's table, no longer the composed, charming man I'd thought I married. He looked broken, defeated, exactly as he'd planned for my family to look. "Your Honor," I began, "James Hartwell didn't just lie to me about who he was. He didn't just blackmail my family or manipulate federal investigations. He stole months of my life by making me believe we were building something real together. He made me fall in love with a fiction while planning my destruction." I paused, looking directly at James. But in the end, he taught me something valuable about the difference between justice and revenge. Justice seeks truth and appropriate consequences. Revenge seeks destruction, regardless of truth. I chose justice, and I'm proud of that choice. The judge sentenced James to 8 years in federal prison. Now, 6 months later, I'm rebuilding my life. The marriage was annulled based on fraud, and I've moved into a small apartment in Charleston's French Quarter. The museum promoted me to head curator after the publicity from the case actually increased donations. Apparently, people found my story inspiring rather than scandalous. My parents and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly. The business is smaller now, but it's honest, and my father seems lighter somehow, as if the weight of his secrets had been crushing him for years. My mother has thrown herself into legitimate charity work, and for the first time in my life I see genuine happiness in her eyes, rather than just social performance. As for love, real love, I'm not in a hurry. I've learned that I'm capable of protecting the people I care about, of making hard choices when necessary, and of distinguishing between justice and destruction. Those are better foundations for a future relationship than romantic gestures and charming smiles. Sometimes I wonder if I could have handled things differently if there was a way to save James from his own revenge fantasy. But then I remember that he made his choices long before he ever met me, and I made mine based on truth rather than manipulation. So here's my question for all of you who've stuck with this crazy story. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and justice? Between protecting someone you love and doing what's right? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Below, I read every single one, and your support has meant everything during this journey. If this story showed you that sometimes the most unexpected person can be capable of fighting back, smash that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama that proves truth really is stranger than fiction. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that justice isn't always loud and dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and absolutely devastating to those who deserve it. Thank you for being part of this incredible, terrible, and ultimately empowering chapter of my life. Remember, family loyalty matters, but so does truth. And sometimes protecting the people you love means holding them accountable for their actions while refusing to let others destroy them with lies. Until next time, stay strong, stay honest, and never underestimate what you're capable of when everything you care about is on the line.